Hello, Cybersecurity National Security Law class. Welcome to Lecture 3. In this class, we're going to talk about the international law of war and how the international law of war might map onto cyberspace. Well, when we're talking about this question of the international law of war, it raises the question of what is war? Now, we might think that the answer to that question is obvious, but as lawyers, of course, we want to think carefully about what the terms we're trying to use mean. And if you think about it a little bit, there are plenty of circumstances in which it might not be entirely clear what is war and what is some other kind of aggression or hostility. One place that theorists of war look to, and the international law of war looks to, is a 19th century Prussian general named von Clausewitz. So von Clausewitz, in a book on war, gave a definition of war that is still very famous and very widely used today. And here's Clausewitz's definition. So Clausewitz says war is an act of force to compel an enemy to do our will, but not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means. This statement of Clausewitz is often paraphrased as saying that war is politics by another means. So notice a few things in this definition that we can draw out. One is that war is violent, and we probably already know that. The other is that war is instrumental. If something is to be called war as opposed to some other sort of violence, it is pursuing some particular goal. And the third is that war is attributable to a political actor. To say that war is attributable to a political actor really refers to our discussion from the first class about what a nation state is and where nation states come from. So we're making a distinction here between violence by a private person, violence by a criminal organization, terroristic kind of violence, from violence that can be attributed to a political actor. Well, some theorists kind of looking at how Clausewitz thinks about war, think about how we would map this onto various kinds of violence. And one thing that Clausewitz was concerned about was talking about the concept of total war. Now, Clausewitz is writing in the 19th century. He's a German thinker. He's heavily influenced by the philosopher Hegel, and Hegel is, very much of his time, kind of interested in the dynamics of the darkness of the human soul, so to speak, the tension within the human person, and the dialectics of what that brings out, the kind of contrasts and conflicts that brings out. And so in thinking about this, Clausewitz thinks about total war on the one hand, which is really pure violence, and about pure politics on the other hand, which is policy without violence. So you can kind of look at this graph up on the screen and say that there's total war, which is complete violence, there's pure politics, which is zero violence, but anywhere in between, there's some kind of mixture. And we can call various things in between as kinds of war. Clausewitz said that total war would drive policy out of office and rule by the laws of its own nature. So notice how Clausewitz here is sort of channeling that Hegelian force in the person, and then is kind of suggesting that a theory of war has to kind of account for that in the political domain. One way that Clausewitz did that is through what is now called the Clausewitz Trinity. So Clausewitz spoke of, number one, primordial violence, hatred, and enmity. Very, very Hegelian terms, right? Number two, the play of chance and probability. And number three, war's element of subordination to rational policy. So there's this dynamic of violence. There's this overlay on that of chance or probability, which in a sense begins to control or tame the violence or influence the violence. But third, kind of on top of that, is rational policy, is taking all of this and putting it into some kind of framework that puts it to some kind of purpose. Now, in contemporary military doctrine, people often talk of Clausewitz's Trinity as being the people, the army, and the government. And Clausewitz didn't quite talk about it that way, but in Clausewitz's writing you can see that he does associate the primordial violence aspect with the people, kind of the mass of the people. He does associate the play of chance and probability with the army. So whereas the mass of people have sort of untamed passions, an army, a disciplined army, begins to act in a certain space and to assess the chances of various things happening and the probabilities of various things happening and to discipline it. And then the element of subordination to rational policy he associates with the government. So on top of all this, there's a governing structure, a government that has some rational policy that is governing the conduct of the army, that is channeling kind of the passions of the people. Now, as we look at all this, it actually relates in some interesting ways to the history of the just war tradition in philosophy. And this tradition goes back at least to St. Augustine in kind of the very early part or just before the Middle Ages. And the notion here is that war is not a good thing. War produces all kinds of terrible effects, but sometimes war is necessary. And in fact, sometimes war is even just. And from a moral perspective, we want to try to assess war and decide, is this just? Is this appropriate to pursue? And there's two parts to this. One is jus ad bellum, and one is jus in bellum. Jus is justice, and bellum is war. And so jus ad bellum is the idea of what are the criteria for justice in entering into a war, and jus in bellum is what are the criteria for justice in pursuing a war. So these kind of classical philosophical norms find their way into contemporary instruments of international law. So jus ad bellum, we find a lot of these principles in the UN Charter, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So some of the basic principles: war has to be prosecuted by a just, competent authority. Now notice here how some of these principles relate to, or how some of Clausewitz's views about war relate to these principles, right? So there's a governing authority, a rational authority, a competent authority that's acting justly to govern and discipline all this. There has to be a just cause for the war. There has to be a just intention in pursuing that cause. So it's not just a case that there's some theoretically just cause, but the intent is really to do something else that is actually unjust. And war is supposed to be a last resort. So every other peaceable, diplomatic, other kinds of means to resolve whatever conflict has arisen ought to be exhausted before a resort to war. Jus in bello, the just proper action in the prosecution of a war, we can find a lot of these historic norms in instruments such as the Hague Convention and the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions. So these will include distinction. So we are supposed to distinguish combatants from non-combatants. So if you are a military participant, then you can be subject to the violence of war, but if you are a civilian and not a military participant, steps are supposed to be taken to try to insulate you from the direct effects of the war. Necessity, the means employed should only be such as are necessary to achieve the just cause. So, if the just cause is to recover some small piece of territory, you don't drop nuclear weapons, things like that. Humanity, the means pursued ought to take into account the humanity of the other side. The other side remain human beings with certain kinds of human and moral rights, even if they are subject to the violence of war. And proportionality, the means pursued should be proportionate to the cause and to the conflict itself. So all of the jus ad bellum principles are designed to mitigate the possibility of nations entering into a war, and all of the jus in bello principles are designed to mitigate the effects and the extent of war in the event that it does have to be entered into. So how do these principles find their way into international law? We talked over the past couple weeks about the very beginnings of sort of what we would think of as modern international law, kind of back to the Peace of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War, and we talked about Napoleonic Wars and World War I, the League of Nations, and then World War II. And after World War II, we have the UN Charter. And the UN Charter, as we said, is a treaty organization. The UN is a treaty organization, and its really primary mission after World War II was to try to prevent another instance of what was either total war or close to total war, which was World War II. So again, see the sort of reference to Clausewitz, the effort to constrain the totalizing effects of war. So Article 2 of the UN Charter lays out the broad general principle, which is that disputes should be resolved peaceably and not through violent means. So UN Article 2 lays out the general principle, which is that disputes are supposed to be resolved peaceably. Members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. Now, in a sense, this is contrary to what Clausewitz said, or at least it recognizes what Clausewitz said, is that war is a form of politics by another means. And the idea here is, let's do politics on the peaceable side of the scale, not on the violent side of the scale. Nevertheless, within the UN Charter, there are two broad exceptions to this principle of nonviolence. One of them is when military action is authorized by the UN Security Council, and the second one is the general international law principle of self-defense, and we'll talk about both of those. So first, the UN Security Council. I'm sure you've heard of the Security Council in the news and so on. What is the Security Council? It is one of the 6 main organs or bodies of the United Nations established in the UN Charter. So those are the General Assembly, the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, which has been in the news a bit lately, and the Secretariat. Now, the Security Council has 5 permanent members: China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. You can see from the makeup of these, except for China, that they reflect kind of the balance of power after World War II, of course excluding the losing side, which is Germany. And then, of course, China added in recognition of China's size and influence as an international power. There are 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council who are elected to 2-year terms. If you look on the UN's website, you can see who those are and who those have been. Now, very important to see how the Security Council works, in that it really requires consensus, and it requires this mix of countries to agree on a policy to pursue. So the Security Council will determine if there is a threat to the peace, a breach of the peace, or an act of aggression, and can then determine what action ought to be taken. And an important thing to note here is that all of the other organs of the UN only make recommendations. The Security Council makes decisions that the members must carry out, ultimately possibly on pain of being removed from the UN. The various things that the Security Council can decide are set forth in Articles 41 and 42. So they can include ceasefires, sanctions. You've seen a lot of things about economic sanctions in the news lately, a blockade, or even collective military action. So kind of the blue-helmeted UN troops or other kinds of collective military action. Article 51 sets out the second exception, which is really codifying a principle of customary international law. International law is a really interesting sort of creature, in that you have positive international law, which is encoded, and you have customary international law, which is not as formal as positive law, but is recognized as part of the traditional conduct, historical conduct of nations, and then finds its way sometimes into the official code. So notice here that Article 51 states that every nation has the right of self-defense and can use force in self-defense. Now, a key phrase in this is that you can use collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against you. Now, there is also a principle that kind of in the jurisprudence of this, that you don't necessarily have to wait till the attack is launched. So certainly if another nation is firing rockets into your territory, you can respond appropriately. On the other hand, if the troops are simply massed at the border and it's evident that they're prepared to invade, you don't necessarily have to wait for the invasion. You can strike first in that instance because it's an imminent attack. But either way, it has to be a currently happening, or an imminent armed attack. So this raises a really key question for us concerning the international law of war and cyberspace, which is, what is an armed attack in cyberspace? The language that is used in the UN Charter, the history of the UN Charter, all has to do with soldiers carrying, rifles, people firing missiles and howitzers, tanks rolling over the border, planes dropping bombs. It has to do with the kind of warfare that we were familiar with from World War II. Now, certainly during World War II, there were electronic operations, jamming radar and things like that. There were psychological and propaganda operations, but the focus of the UN Charter and the law of wars is on real kinetic warfare. How do we apply that today? There really are, in the literature and the scholarship, there are three main schools of thought about how we might do this. Now, these aren't the only possibilities, but these are sort of how scholars in the area see the ideas coalescing. So one is an instrument-based approach, and the idea here is if you look at the attack that has occurred, would you say that the same damage could have been achieved with a purely kinetic attack? So let's say that somebody launches something like the Stuxnet virus, or a virus similar to that, which messes with the control system of a power plant, causes the reactor to overheat, and it explodes. Could you have achieved that without using cyber? You could have, right? You could have planted a bomb. In that case, it would qualify. A second perspective, which is a little bit broader, is effects or consequence based. So here you would say, what were the overall effects of the attack? Now, it may be that some aspects of the attack could only have been carried out by cyber, but nevertheless, the overall effects are similar to a kinetic type of effect. In other words, it causes some physical damage, loss of life, physical injury, things like that. A third approach is even broader. The third approach is a strict liability approach. So the third approach would say any cyber attack against critical infrastructure would automatically be considered equivalent to an armed attack, because critical infrastructure by definition is critical and it's vulnerable, and so therefore we should think about a cyber attack on that kind of infrastructure as an act of war. Like I said, there's no one way to look at this. A number of scholars whom I've read seem to favor the effects-based approach, and perhaps there's some very general consensus around that, but all of these approaches are viable, and this is a thing we can talk about when we meet together in class. Another key issue that we have to think about in terms of how the international law of war relates to cyber attacks is, what about non-state actors? Now, the UN Charter is really focused on hostilities between state actors. It doesn't address, the UN Charter in the law of war, jus ad bello, doesn't address non-state actors. And what do we mean by a non-state actor? Well, what about a coordinated terrorist organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda? What about a sophisticated organized crime syndicate? These are non-state actors. To what extent is it an act of war if a nation state harbors and protects a terror group or an organized crime group, or finances, or just looks the other way? It's not entirely clear, and this is a very difficult issue in cyber, as we've seen. so much of this cyber activity is either hard to attribute to a nation state or in fact involves terror groups or even more likely organized crime groups who may to various degrees be complicit with a nation state. Another principle I wanted to point out to you in the kind of current framework of the international law of war is R2P, or the right to or responsibility to protect. So the R2P arises out of the effort to prevent and mitigate large-scale genocide. So if you think about something relatively recent, like the genocide in Rwanda, and again, that's not really an act of war. It's an internal issue. It's not even really an act of civil war in a sense. It's one group acting to destroy another group. So the R2P principles say that a government, a nation state, has a responsibility to act to prevent genocide, and even broader, the international community has a responsibility to assist and to act. And if the nation state in which the genocide is happening doesn't act, the international community, in fact, has an obligation to act. So the UN Security Council could step in and authorize a coordinated use of force to prevent genocide. And I give you a link in the slides to a website that gives some more information on this. Now, I give you this because I think it raises some interesting questions again about cyber. Is it possible to commit an act of genocide in cyberspace? Perhaps. Is it possible to do things that are leading up to or fueling or facilitating acts of genocide? For sure. How would you deal with that? What kind of attribution would you give? How would the international community act? I think this is an area that's very much open for discussion and scholarship. So how does the international community sort of officially think about cyberspace in the international law of war? And one place to look for this is the United Nations group of government experts. These are groups that are called together by the United Nations to study particular issues. And the United Nations has a number of times called groups together to study this particular issue about cyberspace. 2013, a report was issued on, in the United Nations parlance, it's Information and Communication Technologies, ICTs, really means the internet. And that working group stated that international law norms, including the UN Charter, which includes the laws of war, should apply in cyberspace. So as a broad principle, the United Nations working group, non-binding, but recognizes these principles should apply. Nevertheless, most recently, one of these working groups was convened to try and figure out, well, what does this exactly mean? And the report recognizes that a number of nation states are developing and have developed capacities for cyber war, that there are very harmful attacks that can be targeted on critical infrastructure, that cyber is an important area for terrorism and crime, but really didn't give any clear statement about exactly how the law of war would apply in cyberspace. So there remains this sense that the international law of war has to apply, but really no consensus on exactly how it should apply. So how does this work out in present U.S. national security policy? And I gave to you to read Presidential Policy Directive 20. A presidential policy directive is an executive directive from the president within the president's executive capacity under the Constitution to organize, administer, give policy guidance to the federal government. This particular directive was classified as top secret, and it is among the documents that were disclosed by Edward Snowden. So I think, before this document was disclosed, everybody knew there was something like this out there, but the details of what it contained were not really known until Edward Snowden disclosed. Now, I don't think there's anything really earth-shattering in this document, but it is very interesting to read and see how it's set up. And to me, the particularly interesting thing is to see the way it handles the distinction between defensive cyber operations and offensive cyber operations. Because remember, in the international law of war, it's clear, and it's a principle of customary international law, that there is an inherent right of self-defense. So we could have various disputes about proportionality and so on, but no one would really dispute that you can take defensive measures if you're subject to cyber attacks. The really serious question here is, can you take offensive measures, and what offensive measures can you take, and when could you take them? And would taking some kind of offensive cyber measure be an impermissible act of war? So here you see this distinction in the directive about what defensive and offensive are. You see a really interesting policy statement in the directive, a very broad policy statement, that the United States has an abiding interest in developing and maintaining the use of cyberspace as an integral part of U.S. national capabilities to collect intelligence and to deter, deny, or defeat an adversary. So this is beyond an economic policy statement, a recognition that cyberspace is a vital national security concern. The directive says that the United States will conduct defensive and offensive cyber operations in accordance with international law, including the law of armed conflict. So it's not surprising to see this. Of course, it leaves open the question of how you interpret and apply what the law of armed conflict is as applied to these areas. Now, this is really interesting to me to see in writing. Again, not surprising. I don't think anybody thought this wasn't the case, but to see it in writing, the United States government shall identify potential targets of national importance where offensive cyber operations can offer a favorable balance of effectiveness. The United States will establish and maintain offensive cyber capabilities, and the U.S. will execute those capabilities in a manner consistent with this directive. So right now, the United States government, the United States military and intelligence services have identified and are identifying targets, vulnerabilities, weaknesses, areas where, if it were necessary, we could launch an effective offensive cyber operation. We are, in fact, I think, using some things that could be classified as offensive cyber operations even as we speak. But it's very interesting to see that we've got a very active role. And remember that to identify these targets, you've got to do surveillance, you've got to do covert work, you've got to do hacking and other things like that to figure out where these weaknesses and targets are. So we often speak of China doing this kind of thing, and they do. But we are doing this kind of thing as well. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're doing exactly what China is doing, stealing another country's trade secrets or other things like that, but we are actively engaged in targeting and in strategizing about how we would use offensive cyber. The directive recognizes that both defensive and offensive cyber raises difficult, interesting policy concerns because, notice the language, because cyberspace is globally connected. This goes back to our module on internet governance. Recognizing the global, international nature of cyberspace really changes how you think about these traditional policies and rules that have to do with national borders. Notice also when we talk about these principles of proportionality and necessity, the policy document recognizes that cyber can have unintended or collateral consequences that are very broad, and we have to sort of think about what are those consequences. The directive recognizes that the U.S. will integrate defensive and offensive cyber with all of its other national security apparatus, information, military, economic, financial, intelligence, counterintelligence. So again, we knew this, but this statement clearly sets forth this national policy from the President's desk itself that cyber is fundamentally integrated with all of our other national security interests. Now, these next couple of paragraphs are interesting because they talk about defensive or offensive cyber that might produce cyber effects in the United States. So you might think, well, why would we do that? Why would that happen? Well, imagine if there is a massive attack from another nation state like China that affects the U.S. power grid, and the most immediate response is to shut off a large portion of the network to contain the attack. Well, that would mean the U.S. government shutting down U.S. cyber resources. And that's a big deal, right? It's the U.S. military acting on U.S. soil in ways that, at least in the short term, could hurt U.S. interests. Sometimes that may be necessary. So here is an indication that that kind of action has to be specifically approved by the president, unless there's a department or agency that otherwise has authority to do that, and there's an emergency. Now, the directive has its own definition of emergency cyber action. The very end of this module, we're going to talk about the law of emergencies, and we'll come back to this and talk about it a little more. But it's an issue I find really difficult and interesting and historically interesting because, again, remember that there was this deep concern about a standing federal army. That deep concern had to do with the notion that the federal government might actually occupy and take over the states, and that the police power, the police function, preventing crime, ensuring the general public safety, generally ought to reside under local control. And so that's why even today, most police functions, everyday police functions, your traffic police, your various kinds of crimes are handled at the state and local level. Of course, we do have federal police functions, which are significantly broader than they were at the time of the founding or any time in the 19th century or so. We have the FBI, we have narcotics operations, all those kinds of things. But we still have some of those concerns about the role of the federal as opposed to state. But even more fundamentally, we have really deep concerns about the deployment and use of military assets for things that are otherwise civilian, state, or local issues. We'll come back to that in the law of emergencies, but notice that is part of this cyber directive. Another key question is interaction with other nation states. So what if we have to conduct a defensive or offensive cyber operation that is going to affect other nation states who may not be the perpetrator of what it is that we're responding to? So the directive says that we need to try to seek their consent. And that makes sense, and that's what you would anticipate. It's a similar thing that if you had to march your troops across somebody else's territory to get to where they had to be, to another territory, you would ideally want to have the consent and cooperation. But notice that the president can do these kind of operations without consent, if it's necessary. So raises really difficult international relations concerns. When we talk about surveillance in the next couple of classes in this module, we'll see how there are international concerns. Some nations in the European Union really expressed shock and surprise and disgust when the Edward Snowden documents were disclosed, that they also were subject to surveillance and that they didn't know what was going on. Now we'll talk about that when we get to it. I actually think some of that shock and disgust was a bit feigned. And in fact, the UK and France in particular, and Germany, engage in this activity too, to a great degree. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. Just notice that there's a general principle of consent, but that principle can be suspended when it's necessary. So notice again a principle of specific presidential authorization if a cyber action is going to have significant consequences as that is defined in the directive. So the notion is, and you can see how this gets integrated into overall national security strategy, that this is a presidential level kind of decision. But again, with this counterbalance that if there's an emergency, an agency head or someone under the president can act to deal with the emergency before the president gets involved. So the directive lays out a framework for decision making under the directive. And the framework is really nothing, I think, earth-shattering or surprising, but again, it's kind of useful to see it in writing. So the policy considerations that are supposed to go into a deliberation about whether to use defensive or offensive cyber operations include the impact of the operation, the risks of it, the methods that would be used, the geography and identity of those involved, transparency, the extent to which it is or can be disclosed, and the legal authorities and civil liberties concerns that it raises. All of these things, I think, in a very broad sense, relate to the Clausewitz discussion of total war versus pure politics. So this is an effort to encode in some kind of policy structure something akin to violence that is under some kind of rational policy regime and isn't just pure total destruction. So where does this leave us for our discussion in class and to kind of think about and ponder as we go through this module? I think the big question is how we have this international law framework that exists that is focused on this Clausewitzian understanding of war and that is focused on kinetic action. How does this map onto cyberspace? Thinking back to the module on internet governance and to some of the materials that we looked at in that module on whether cyberspace really is a unique space. Is it a unique space? To what extent is it a unique space? To what extent does its uniqueness cause difficulties with respect to the international law of war? Are there aspects of the international law of war that may have to change or accommodate cyberspace? And how are we going to deal with all these things as a nation? These are all really interesting and difficult questions, and we'll talk about them when we see each other in class.